This is part 3, the last part of our types of claims discussion. And for this video, I'm going to focus on these two types, what our textbook calls values claims, arguments about the nature of what values we might hold, what values are appropriate. They divide these into two groups, evaluation claims and proposals. An evaluation claim is X a good or a bad Y, and I'll show you some examples of that. A proposal claim, should we do X? Should we pick one particular course of action or over another? And again, chapter 10 discusses hybrid claims because that's probably the kind of claim that you're really going to make in a paper. You might do an evaluation where you look at different aspects of what's the best place to go to college or what's the best place to get a nursing degree, for instance. I've had papers about both in the past. And then you might make a proposal at the end of it that maybe other students take up a similar position. So let's see. Evaluation and ethical claims are covered in chapter 13. This is actually a very common one. We make these kinds of arguments all the time over some very simple things you'll see in just a second. Basically, we're saying that something is or is not a good something else. What we call this is a criteria match system. We establish a series of criteria, a series of reasons why we should do something, a series of factors that we think are important. We also should make sure that these are criteria that the audience is going to accept. Maybe not in the same way that we do, but at least they accept that these criteria exist, that they're valid, and that they're useful for this. Sometimes you might have to think about criteria that are going to require a defense on your part. And as we go through this, I'll talk about a couple of ways in which you can do that. Some simple categories that these, or simple topics that these arguments fall into, movie or restaurant reviews are a simple form of evaluation argument where we look at things like the cost, the location, the quality of the food, the type of food, things like that. We make these kinds of arguments in our heads all the time when we decide what movie are we going to see. Are we going to go see Black Panther? Are we going to go see Dunkirk? Are we going to eat at Applebee's or Olive Garden? Are we going to go to Tony's? Are we going to go to some little restaurant nobody's ever heard of before? Burger King or McDonald's? Wendy's or Chick-fil-A? Where are we going to go? And we use different criteria to make those kinds of decisions. How much money do we have? What am I in the mood for? Which is closer? Where do my friends want to go? What's my prior experience? Things like that. These are all evaluation arguments. They get more complex when we look at things like what's the right college or what's the right major. We might look at unemployment statistics. We might look at starting salaries. We might look at difficulty of program or availability of the program. Is it only available at a public college or is it only available at a private college? Are we going to go to WashU or UMSL? Those are the kinds of evaluation arguments that we make all the time. Okay, one that's a little bit more complicated still is abstinence only versus comprehensive sex ed, and there we might want to look at outcomes. We might want to look at what happens if we have abstinence only sex ed, where we don't talk about a full range of sexual practices or beliefs or topics. And a more comprehensive approach where we address a variety of issues that another system might not address. This is an extraordinarily complex issue, and there's data on both sides of the equation. So it's not a simple thing to argue about at all, but determining the criteria by which you make these evaluations, that's where it gets complicated, particularly with something like sex ed. Okay, that's where it's important to determine what category sex ed fits into it. Is it educational activity? Is it one that has a moral component? Is it one that's purely physiological and social? Or is it something where religious values play a role in it? And then we have to determine what the function of those categories are. And we have to determine what criteria we use to assign things into that category. And then we have to think about relative weight. We might say, well, is it, well, I won't go into that. Let's just leave it at that. Okay. Ethical arguments focus on moral issues more than like social issues. The two classic ones that fit into ethical arguments tend to be abortion and capital punishment, things that we debate all the time. These are issues for which we've never developed a solution that the majority of Americans accept. In this particular case, when we're looking at ethical arguments, we have to think about them in one of two ways: the utility of a position or the principles. Okay, utility is, well, does capital punishment really deter murder, for instance, which is what we usually tend to use capital punishment for? Sometimes we use it for treason, I think, but that hasn't happened in many, many, many years. So we have to say, well, is there a utility to this? Is there a reason that is logical that allows us to take the life of another human being? And are those reasons sufficient to provide the results that we want, that is to reduce the number of murders? Or is it a question of following principles here where we believe that people who commit certain crimes should pay for them in a certain way? Are these pre-existing values religious? Are they moral? Are they ethical? And we might have to look at those values and decide whether those values are ones that our audience will accept or not accept. And again, there are huge divisions over these kinds of issues in our society. So they're not simple. This is not an easy topic to write about. Okay. One of the things that pops up, particularly with capital punishment, is how complicated it is. I always tell students to steer away from capital punishment arguments because they don't tend to be very well thought out. And I think it's because people think they're simple, but they're actually not. Lethal injection is the major way that people are put to death under system of capital punishment. The problem is access to the drugs. Where do we find them? Where do they come from? Missouri is kind of a test case for this because we have a very complex way of obtaining the drugs that we use. And this article from BuzzFeed from last year talks about just how complex these decisions are. We have to go to a compounding pharmacy in another state and pay cash, basically, is what we have to do, because major drug manufacturers will not let the standard drugs used in lethal injections be used for lethal injections, because it's essentially the same drug as we use for general anesthesia. It's all made overseas. It's made in countries that do not use capital punishment as part of their justice system. So we have to find local sources. There's no American company that makes this stuff. So we have to get it made one at a time by compounding pharmacies, with the resultant uneven quality of the product that might prolong someone's suffering. Like I said, it's a complex business. Some of the problems with this, again, has to do with standards, commonplace versus ideal. You know, in an ideal world, we'd be able to drive our cars, for instance, and not have any kind of pollution come out of them. Well, commonplace, I mean, that's a very difficult thing to obtain. You're not going to get to that point with electric cars where you can drive across the country and recharge them all the time, at least not with the technology that we have. So we say, well, is reducing emissions, is that really something we should be focused on? And that's an evaluation kind of argument. Are there mitigating circumstances? Are there technological or personal or social reasons why something may or may not be a good idea? This comes up, by the way, in sentencing hearings a lot. Does this person come from a background where it's difficult for him or her to understand issues of right and wrong, for instance? Are they mentally or psychologically disabled in some way? There's a variety of Supreme Court cases, for instance, regarding the death penalty that have to do with that. Age, for instance, is something that's important. You cannot be put to death if you commit a murder and you're under the age of 18. If you're 18 or over, then you can be subject to the death penalty. Why? Well, because there's a Supreme Court decision that says that you can't be put to death if you were under 18, that is not a legal adult at the time that you committed the crime. So one day can make a difference. That's a mitigating circumstance. Choosing between two goods or two bads. And sometimes that's a problem that we run into. How bad is bad? How good is good? These become really complicated issues. And how do we fix these problems? Well, we try to do this empirically. We try to look for places where we can provide data that help the audience make up their mind. One of the classic evaluation arguments, or ethical ones, that comes up has to do with the cost of clothing. Most of the clothing we have in the United States is made overseas. It's made by people who make very little money compared to what we spend on it. Well, is this ethical? Is this okay? Well, that's a really good question. If you say, well, it allows us to spend money on other things so that we don't have to spend an inordinate amount of money on clothes, maybe it's a good idea. But are we exploiting this worker? Is that a fair thing to do? Are we taking something from her or him Or are we, as some people argue, saying we're providing an opportunity? These people wouldn't have any jobs at all if they didn't make clothing for us. That's a little bit like the Ellen Goodman discussion in Womb for Rent in the essay we read in chapter 8. And then, of course, there's cost. That's always the interesting thing. Could you set a moral principle that was so high that it would cost us a great deal of money as a society to pay for it? And how much would that cost be? And then we always have to address these things about cost-benefit analyses, how that works. Medicare for all is an evaluation argument, for instance, in part because it looks at this issue of, is this just a different way to spend money? Is this a better way? Is the cost of this thing so high that we could never do it? I mean, it's one of those complex issues that doesn't admit to an easy solution, but it would be a good one for an evaluation argument. How do we solve some of these problems? Well, we use criteria that the audience may already know and accept. We grant limitations in these criteria, and we explain the capability and limitations of any empirical measures, that is, any data collection that we've done. And we try to be as specific as we can be. A simple paper on, like, where's the best place to go for nursing. I've had students write that doing a 2-year degree and then continuing it online through UMSL, for instance, or another institution to get a BSN is the cheapest, fastest, easiest way to get into the system. I've had other students who said, oh no, the social and economic and political sort of environment in which a 4-year BSN occurs, as well as the educational environment, is simply so much better that we produce better nurses. The data is unclear, by the way. Both nurses get hired. The starting salaries are remarkably the same. There's not a whole lot of difference. But where's the best place to go? Evaluation argument. This is the 5th and last of the types of claims, the proposal. As I say in the slide, many arguments end with a proposal. Some arguments, however, approach the whole idea of proposals throughout. I had a student several years ago who wrote a paper on bike lanes in St. Louis County. Should we build more of them? And she had a proposal to do exactly that, how much it would cost, where they would go, what the benefits and disadvantages of them would be. Her entire argument was a proposal one. It's a call for action. That's really what a proposal argument is. I mentioned a video, Money and Medicine, in here that I don't know if I can link to it in Blackboard, and it's a very famous one that makes a proposal about a way of using data to help us control healthcare costs. The structure that they fall into for a proposal argument, they said, here's this problem, this proposal is a solution, and here's why this solution is the best. So they're really easy to write in the sense that they have a very simple, straightforward organizational pattern. They fall into 2 types according to our textbook. There's practical considerations and there's policy arguments, policy proposals. A smaller scale thing, for instance, I don't know if any of you have eaten our cafeteria, but a common complaint is that we don't have enough healthy food. Although we've done a lot to address that this year. We've added a salad bar, for instance. We've added some low-fat options on the grill, things like that. The question really is this a practical solution to a problem in the sense that not a lot of students seem to choose healthy foods? Everybody wants it, but nobody seems to eat it very much. But whatever solution you come up with would come in the form of a proposal. Larger policy issues, things like how much a Pell Grant should be worth, how long should people be able to use Pell Grants, what are the income limits for Pell Grants. These are all part of a proposal argument. Same thing with student loans. Setting the interest rate, who controls them, whether they should be public or privately funded. These are, again, policy kinds of proposal arguments. The trickiest part about a proposal is getting your audience interested in it. Audiences are notoriously conservative. They don't want to change anything. Okay, and all of us are in this shape. We don't want to have our views challenged. We don't want to spend more money. Most people don't like to change their minds. In a proposal, it's complicated because that natural resistance can be very strong unless you can establish something that our textbook calls presence, some kind of personal involvement in the audience. And this is actually a form of pathos, but it should be based on some kind of logical premise. The photograph that I have here is of a student who graduated from here a few years ago. When she graduated, as you can see, she was a honor student. She made a little gown for her dog, her support dog. And if I wanted to get more money for the community college, I would say, here's this woman, and here's her support dog, and here's what she did at graduation. Here's what we do in the community college. We take people with disabilities, we take people with a variety of factors in their lives that don't make them typical college students, and we help them achieve something that they otherwise would not be able to achieve. We make them fully productive, contributing members of our society. And so I would use this image to kind of establish this presence and say, look, if you give us more money, we can take care of more people like this student. That's why we need it. Here's my proposal. And so I think this kind of example can be very, very helpful, particularly at the beginning or towards the end of a paper, because that's where you need to engage your audience the most. So think about that. Another way to think about this is to make sure that you convince the audience that the problem exists. That's why we start with the problem, and you try to do it as precisely as you can. We make specific proposals in the next part that indicates things like cost and trade-offs and scope. How many people would you help? What would the cost be? What are we currently spending? Things like that. And show that whatever your solution, your proposal is actually going to work. And then the last part of it would be the justification. And I've given you a link in Blackboard to an article called Hotspotters, which is a proposal to expand a certain kind of medical coverage. And so you can take a look at that and see if you think that Gawande's proposal to expand medical coverage using a particular type of approach to providing medical care would work. Here are some options, and again, these come from our textbook. The first is what's called a claim type strategy. That's where you mix a group of claims together and you work them up in a way that helps you make a particular proposal one that for a unique problem. And the bike lanes in St. Louis County one was actually one that used a lot of these things. Cause and effect, if we have bike lanes, it reduces accidents. Resemblance, we have special lanes for cars. Why not have special lanes for bikes? We also had some categories that which you worked with, the student worked with, in terms of how different people would respond to these things. It was really an interesting paper, very sophisticated. The second form is what our textbook calls a stock issue strategy. That is ones where we are making an argument that other people have made, and we're simply providing new data, and we're providing a slightly different point of view on it. And of course, here are the 5 considerations that we have to think about. You've got to establish that the problem really exists. You've got to establish that your particular proposal is going to solve it. You've got to establish that there's no simpler solution, that it's going to work, and that the consequences are manageable. So here's some summaries. Basically, you've got 5 claim types. You've got the nature of truth and reality claims, definition, resemblance, cause and effect. You've got the values claims, evaluation, ethical, and proposal. You've got 3 different forms of argument. The classic argument form, Rogerian, or what we might call a delayed thesis, or what we might call dialogic. That's the second one. Toulmin arguments, which we've talked about in chapter 7 in the section on logic, he tends to follow a little bit different argument form, but it's fundamentally a classical one. But I break it out here as a separate category, his idea of claims and warrants and data and backing and grounds and things like that, because it's a modified version of the classical that kind of exists in its own world. I leave out one-sided because those are the least effective arguments, and I wouldn't try to make one of those. Whatever claim you make has to be generally logical, no matter which claim type you pick. And again, as I said in the first slides, in part 1, establish where you stand, figure out what your claim type is, think about where your audience is, and we'll do some formal exercises in that later, and then choose your argument form. And remember that you can use multiple claim types in the same argument, what we call a hybrid one. Okay? So that's our summary. That's kind of the end of this discussion, and I hope you found it interesting. Please let me know if you have questions, and let me know also after you've read the book if there's other issues that you see that I haven't talked about. Thank you for your attention.